This is my first foray into PowerPoint, and no list of thanks would be complete without thanking Janine Moore, Department Secretary of the IPFW Department of English and Linguistics. She did this whole thing for me. She would make time between my classes. We would sit down. We would scrounge through, rearrange images. And Michelle Deviney and Kate Butler had to put up with some nonsense as well, and they came through in the clutch. So I thank all three of them. Special gratitude to Janine, who couldn't be here this evening. Lance mentioned the title, The Sacred and the Profane. This comes from the Romanian anthropologist, Mircea Eliade. In The Sacred and the Profane, Eliade distinguishes between numinous experience and the profane world. And one of the wonderful things about surrealism, which is a artistic movement that I've been involved in nearly 30 years now, is that it tries to bring these two parts of the world, parts of the human psyche together in some pretty powerful ways. So that's where I get the title of this. Last October, I learned from a friend whom I've known for a few years, and I never knew this story. She told me that before we had really gotten to know one another, she had apparently gone to a few of my poetry readings. And she told someone the following. She said, "I don't know what's wrong with that man, but I never want to go to another one of his poetry readings again." And I thought that was a pretty powerful statement on her part, because surrealism isn't easily graspable. She says now she's kind of hooked on this kind of poetry, this kind of art form. And I really valued what she had to say about that. And tonight's focus is really to, in a sense, give you a crash course in not only surrealism but dada, and to hopefully make you less afraid not only of it but of attending a poetry reading that may indeed be focused on that. This is one of my very favorite paintings ever. It's called The Village of the Mermaids. And I have Marianne to thank for showing me this painting. Something like 28 years ago, she took me to the Art Institute in Chicago. She knew that I was just developing an interest in surrealism, and she wanted to show me this wing of work. And she said, "You really have to see this painting." And it's this, as you see, this gorgeous and haunting painting by Paul Delvaux, who was one of the last surviving surrealists. He recently died probably a decade or so ago. And this is one of the few Paul Delvaux, actually, in which his subjects are clothed. And as you can see from this painting, they are about ready to burst out of their clothes, primarily. And what Paul Delvaux does is work so much in the nude form. He tries to paint nudes as some sort of an emblematic symbol of beauty in the universe. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons of that, including the problematic dimension of some of those depictions this evening somewhat as well. But what I admire about this painting so much, The Village of the Mermaids, is as you can see way in the back, I hope you can see, I hope it's clear enough, there are actually mermaids there. And it's very difficult, thinking of dichotomy, are the mermaids ready to become these women? Are these women ready to become these mermaids? The painting actually calls our attention to try to figure out what the dynamic and what the relationship is. I don't know if this pointer will work. I'm going to try it. Does this show up on the screen? Okay. There's this dark figure, this man who walks past, and this woman here, she casts a shadow. This woman casts a shadow. We don't have much more in this painting but that, except some chipped seashells along the path here. You will, if you ever look at Paul Delvaux's work, you'll see that he paints the same woman over and over. And so I wanted to share this with you. This painting really began to hook me on the haunting and mysterious aspect of surrealism. Before we can talk about surrealism, I'd like to talk about Dadaism, which is a term we probably have heard sometime or another. And J.Lu Naum, the Romanian poet, once said, "What we need is a new Dada today, a new Dada every day, without Dadaism or Dadaists." And that's a pretty good quote, because what he has captured here is the essence of Dada, which is, in a sense, to tear down many of the old art forms and lay something open for us for the new. I should back up here a moment. I'm conflating traditions here slightly. This is Merit Oppenheim's piece, Object. She's a Swiss artist, and we often refer to this as the fur-lined cup and fur-lined saucer. It's actually a surrealist piece, but it has some of the qualities of Dada, which I'll get into momentarily, and one of those qualities is the sense of the ready-made object, that you can look just out into the world and there are objects that we can bring in that seem artistic themselves if we dabble with them just a little bit. This is a few things. I'm not going to read all of this. Like I said, I was very excited about the lecture. My one hesitancy was I've never done PowerPoint. So please bear with me as I learn how to do this. The title of this slide comes from a Lee Harwood essay on Dada, which I've always loved. Dada, my heart belongs to Dada. Again, capturing some of the innocence and playfulness of what the Dada experience was really about. Dada as an art form really began in Zurich in 1916, growing out of World War I. It was a response to what I say here, the industrialized weaponry and what Robert Hughes calls the mechanization of instruments of death. And primarily there was a series of artists, I'll show you pictures later of Tristan Tzara and Hugo Ball, who felt that we had been lied to by politicians, by generals on the field, and even by journalists who were writing about the war. And for the Dadaists then, they believed that lies contaminated words and that these lies were at the base of all official language. The speech of their elders was thus not to be trusted. In short, language itself was contaminated. And this is Tristan Tzara here and Hugo Ball and Hans Arp, three famous Dadaists, in a very playful pose. There was among intellectuals a longing for a clean slate. Dadaists wanted to cleanse language. They wanted to abolish the lies that were dormant within it. In a sense, we could then look at Dada as a pacifist movement. It was really an attempt to remove violence from the core of language and the violence, basically, of the lie. Many people have various theories about how the word Dada itself began, how it was formulated. Some people said it's a made-up word, just a bunch of nonsense syllables. In Russian, it actually means yes, yes, which is kind of ironic because Dada is known for negating a lot of things. Perhaps two yeses make a no in this case, I don't know. In Romanian, it designates a rocking horse. Others note that Dada itself resembles a child's first utterance. Dada, as representative of a child's first utterance, is important, I say here, because at the core of Dada was the desire to really to go back to scratch, to return to the beginnings before language was contaminated by violence, and to start culture really from the beginning. This peculiar-looking character here is Hugo Ball. He was a famous Dadaist with Tristan Tzara. He used to perform at the Café Voltaire in Zurich. And you probably remember in the last slide I talked about that the Dadaists wanted to purify language. Part of what they would do, in this case Hugo Ball, they would dress up in mock garb and perform fake rituals. They would pronounce gibberish. They'd get up in the cafe and they would say, well, this is art. We're going to purify language by just babbling and by pretending that we are in some sort of ritualistic garb. And that's what I mentioned here in the first bullet point. There was also, as I mentioned before, a focus on innocence, and its metaphor was childhood. Thus, Dada focused on elementary art and even primitive items that could save humankind from the madness of culture. This element that I say here about primitive art and childhood really began to manifest in a couple of big Dada techniques, one of which was chance operations and another of which was the ready-made object. One of the things that Dadaists were fond of were to take cultural writings, for example, and cut them up, cut words and phrases out, put them in a hat, and drop them onto the floor or a piece of paper and let chance determine how these bits of language fit together. And they actually came up with some really wonderful poems from newspapers, from magazines, from instruction manuals, and that sort of thing. The ready-made, I'm going to show you some ready-mades here in a moment. Here's one, a famous one by Marcel Duchamp, which is called Fountain. I would be willing to wager that most of you have seen this one at some point or another. This was done in 1917, and you'll see over here he has written R. Mutt, and he first displayed this in an art gallery, and it caused quite a scandal. But what the Dadaists were basically saying was that we could look at the world around us and we could remove it from the previous context in which we normally see it, in this case a urinal, put it in a different context, and it has a different sensation and a different sensibility to it. Again, this was the childlike way of seeing what we normally pass by every day, for instance, a urinal, trying to see it with new eyes. But because of this kind of thing, frankly, Dada got a bad rap, and it still has a bad rap in the art world in some ways, as really people seeing it in the more limiting fashion, which is that it was art that was against itself. And I have another couple of pieces to show this. But what really may be true about this is, although that may be true, the point I want to make here is that the point of using the ready-made says that the world is already so full of interesting objects that the artist need not add to these. He or she could just pick one of these objects at random, and this ironic choice was equivalent to the act of artistic creation itself. This is a famous Duchamp called The Bicycle Wheel. I'm sure most or many of you certainly have seen it, from 1913. Again, he defamiliarizes the bicycle wheel from its previous context, which is being on a bicycle. And a very funny one, this one didn't show up as well on the slide, but the Mona Lisa, he's redone with a goatee here and a mustache. And then he's written under here the letters LHOOQ, which is an abbreviation in French that stands for She Has a Hot Ass. So Dada is also trying to have fun with the old art forms to help us see the Mona Lisa in a new way, to sort of make our engagement with that text, in this case a work of art, fresh and new and childlike in the most playful sense. So that's your airplane ride through Dada. And you know that my focus is really surrealism, but we need to begin from Dada to get a sense of what I want to say about surrealism tonight. So what the heck is surrealism? Well, here's a few things to think about. It's an artistic movement that began primarily in 1919 in France and that flourished throughout the 20s and 30s. It's still active worldwide today, and I stand as testimony and testament to the fact that it is still thriving, even here in Fort Wayne. It's a cross-disciplinary movement, which is why Janine came through and saved the day with this PowerPoint, because how could you give a presentation on surrealist writing without seeing some of the art? There's this incredible cross-pollination of visual art and film and literature. It was the hallmark of surrealism and is the hallmark of surrealism. In a nutshell, surrealism holds that the unconscious, intuitive faculties of humankind have atrophied, and that it's the role of the artist to rekindle these by exploring what we in surrealism call the world of the dream. Here's the primary innovator of surrealism, although there were hundreds and have been hundreds of people involved in the movement. But when we think surrealism, we normally think of André Breton, who was a medic in World War I and became so disillusioned with the death and destruction. He actually began as a Dadaist and was good friends with Tristan Tzara until they had a falling out. And this is a young picture of Breton. I love this with the microscope because surrealism also tried to focus on trying to prove that the unconscious was viable, and they set up a bureau for the research and development of surrealist studies, and they in many ways tried to adopt the language of science in order to prove that the unconscious was a fertile and generative terrain to explore. They particularly went back to Freudian theory and many other things that I'll talk about momentarily. And here's an older picture of Breton. Like Dada before it, Surrealism values and explores the magical power of chance operations. One of the techniques we use is called exquisite corpse, and I could write down a sentence, I could hand it to Mark, I could turn it this way so that Mark doesn't see what I wrote, and he can write a sentence down, and he'll turn the page over, and he'll hand it to Mary Ann, and it will go throughout all of you, and then we'll unwind this thing at the end of our session today, and we will read these seemingly independent statements and see if they add up to something larger, as if our collective unconscious, to borrow a term from Jung, is in some way cooperating with the chance operation of this technique, as I said, which is called the exquisite corpse, and say that this is art. And I've done exquisite corpse poems with my students. They can testify. I see Carly's here. I see Lynn Ann's here. Many of you I can't see. But I know you can testify, perhaps afterwards, that some of the poems we've written are startlingly amazing in the ways that the individual statements end up adding up to something larger, as if it was really written by one person. That's one example of chance operations. Surrealism is really much more hopeful than Dada. It believes in the possibility of vision and the ability for art to, underscored here, evoke a state of awareness that returns one to psychic wholeness and well-being. Evocation is key. This is why we're not going to see much narrative when we read a poem that's surrealist. People like the person who actually had said she never wanted to attend one of my poetry readings again. There's very little story in many surrealist poems because it's built upon arcs of association from one image to another image that then begin to accrete and draw upon the magical power of evocation to effect a psychic change in the reader or the participant. That the surrealists believe that the logic of the linear discourse will take us only so far, and that what we need to do is change the language, change the discourse, disrupt it in some way, find a deep image that actually acts like a magical spell or an invocation in order to create a spark in the psyche of the hearer, the listener, or the seer, if it's a work of art. Surrealism was not just some mystical, and is not some just mystical artistic experience where people don't care about society. It was equally a social movement. You could actually map surrealism on a continuum from the social to the mystical, and many of the surrealists moved back and forth throughout their lives. Many were members of the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s until they realized that ultimately the Communist Party wanted to suppress artistic freedom, which didn't match much with this whole sense of liberation that the surrealists were really all about. But we can say there is a reciprocity between social change and individual psychological change. You can't have one without the other, and as the surrealists say. This is one of my favorite surrealists, someone I hold in my heart dearly. Robert Desnos was killed in a concentration camp just at the end of World War II. He was a great, what we call a sleep talker. He was very big in surrealism in the early part of the movement, which we refer to as the period of hypnotic sleeps. And it is the hallmark of surrealism to practice automatic writing. You can go back and you can edit it, but what you want to do is you want to get up in the morning and write something while you're in bed, write a little bit before you go to bed, get yourself into a dream state, wake yourself up and write. Well, what Robert Desnos could do was he could fall asleep. He could be in a cafe. I've read numerous accounts of this. He could fall asleep. He could be engaged in a sentence, as we are now. And then he would sleep talk. He would have these wild images, and he would be asleep. He'd have wild images for, 20 to 30 minutes, and then he'd suddenly wake up, and he would pick up the thread mid-sentence from where he had dropped off. It was an amazing thing. Ultimately, you may be wondering, well, why is this only in the early period of surrealism? The period of the hypnotic sleeps had to be discontinued. They were becoming dangerous. I think some of the early surrealists didn't quite understand what they were getting into when they were going that far into the unconscious without some kind of guidance. One night in a trance state, Robert Desnos chased another surrealist, Paul Eluard, around a table with a knife and tried to kill him, and they were best friends. Another time, Andre Breton walked into a surrealist happening, which was several surrealists sitting around trying to get themselves into a trance state. And René Crevel had led an entire group of participants into a closet where they were trying to hang themselves. So just like, say, parallel would be in the 60s with experiments with LSD and so forth, if you open the psyche too quickly, too soon, without any kind of guidance, things can go kind of crazy. And so the early surrealists really began to see the period of hypnotic sleeps as no longer being a generative form for them to follow. Another hallmark is the juxtaposition of distant realities. It's the bringing together of two or more unrelated objects or events in a seemingly incongruous situation. It often can be humorous. You'll notice I'm going to give you these 8 surrealist principles, and some of them, there's some crossover. There's not a definite border on all of them. You might do automatic writing in order to create a juxtaposition, as an example. But perhaps the clearest rendering of juxtaposition is Lautréamont's phrase, beautiful like the fortuitous meeting on a dissection table of a sewing machine and an umbrella. And that yielded what the surrealists called not only a juxtaposition, but an instant of the marvelous. And I'll show you the marvelous momentarily. This is a famous painting by René Magritte, which is really based on a famous reclining woman by Jacques-Louis David. The coffin is situated in a reclining position with, the clothing there and, situated on the sofa. And again, it's... What we basically do in a juxtaposition is defamiliarize one of the objects. We take a coffin, we bend it, we put it onto a sofa where it no longer would be, and we take its clothing there and put all of that together. Associative leaping, there's no photograph, there's no painting here to illustrate this because I'm going to illustrate that later in reading some poems. It's a mental leaping, one thought to another that's purposeful. It's not just random kind of leaping around in a poem. Creation, if the surrealists believed in the unconscious and in the intuition, they believed in the creation of a dream or hallucinatory atmosphere. This is a famous painting by Salvador Dali called The Persistence of Memory, that's something like this with these melting watches, unless you're in a lecture that goes on interminably, is showing the elongation of time, and something we might not ever see except in a dream. It holds forth that the dream or hallucination is real, it's purposeful, it's as important as what we have in waking reality. So surrealism is basically saying we have a superrealism in which our unconscious is atrophied. We need to bring it into alignment with our conscious minds and join those two forces together to gain greater resonance from our selves and our psychological wholeness. I mentioned the marvelous. This is a moment of jarring or arresting beauty and insight, and certainly that Magritte juxtaposition of the coffin is an instance of the marvelous. It's something intuitively familiar in the strange and wonderful. There's something familiar to us, even though we find it strange to see the coffin reclining on the sofa. It also feels as if we've experienced that in some capacity, the surrealists would say. It allows for existence or occurrence of supernatural events with a focus on their beauty. Lance mentioned convulsive beauty earlier. Breton states in the first manifesto, "Let us not mince words. The marvelous is always beautiful. Anything marvelous is beautiful. In fact, only the marvelous is beautiful." Here we have chance operations, which I've already discussed from a previous point. And certainly, a last couple of these 8 principles I want to touch on is humor. Surrealists often employ playful juxtapositions, absurd situations, This is a Magritte. I hope it shows up enough that the man's body is a bird cage. We pull his clothing back, and the man's body is a bird cage. It's called The Liberator. And this is a Salvador Dali over here, which has the great title of Face of Mae West, which may be used as an apartment. And take a good look at it. It is the face of Mae West, which can be used as an apartment. He did that in the mid-30s before his later work. Finally, we have the use of eroticism. Because of their love of aesthetic beauty, as well as their deep roots in Romanticism and Freudian theory, Surrealists recognize the poetic force of eros as primary in their endeavors. This is a famous Man Ray photo. We see the woman's body as a violin or a cello here. Now, this is the part where I said I wanted to pose some problems with the use of eros in Surrealist work. No serious scholar can deny that the role of the erotic in Surrealist art is problematic because male Surrealists continuously view women as other. That's not going to get us very far if we're trying to dissolve dichotomy. Here's the bind, and this is a quote from Quao. The Surrealists' commitment to the liberation of sexual experimentation offered an opportunity to reevaluate conventional concepts and representations of sexuality, especially for women artists who were associated with the Surrealist circle. However, in practice, femininity was often defined in relationship to dependence on masculinity. The Surrealists viewed woman as other to man, whereas male Surrealists, for the purpose of fulfilling their desires and fantasies, often used female images as icons. Most of the women's Surrealist artists created works of self-representation or self-reference as an effort to artistically express the themes that were close to female experiences and to gain their own self-definition. This is a Magritte photo collage. This is called I Do Not See the Woman Hidden in the Forest. And these are all famous male Surrealists. René Magritte, André Breton, Louis Buñuel, the filmmaker who did The Andalusian Dog, Paul Eluard, Yves Tanguy, Max Ernst, very young picture of Salvador Dali. My response to this piece is, well, of course they do not see the woman hidden in the forest, and the title of it has woman even in parentheses. They do not see her because their eyes are closed to her, and they are, in a sense, objectifying her and making her into the image of their dream. So early Surrealist women usually responded in one or more of the following three ways. They celebrated the liberation from convention and sexual repression. This is the age of Freud, don't forget, that this view offered. I will show you some examples of this momentarily. Secondly, they critiqued the objectification by reversing the gaze. And thirdly, they sometimes chose to delve more deeply into the ancient, lost, hermetic, magical traditions, particularly those that were centered around mysticism and female empowerment. This is a Man Ray photograph that really is representative of the first trend, where many women were celebrating sexual freedom. This is one of his famous models, Merit Oppenheim, who also modeled clothing for French fashion magazines. He has a whole series of photos by Merit Oppenheim. This is the woman, by the way, who did the piece I showed you earlier called Object, which is the fur-lined cup and saucer. And we'll see this particularly in Man Ray, the celebration of the female form. And many of the early women Surrealists, Lee Miller, Merit Oppenheim, Valentine Hugo, all of these women celebrated this liberation in that way. More common, I would say, are the women who painted pieces in which they decided to what I call reverse the gaze. This is a Kay Sage piece, and what we have here is we have the bare-skinned back rather than a frontal view, and she invites us on a journey with her where we are looking with her onto, interestingly, either a barren landscape or a landscape that has potential. It's empty, and we are invited to fill this landscape in some way. So she's taking us on her gaze and not allowing us to see her full on. This is a haunting piece. This is called The End of the World by Leonore Fini, who was an Italian surrealist. And this, we have this sort of really stolid, solidified Barbie doll image. And below it, we have a reflection that's very grotesque and dark and murky. This water is not generative. We have eyes that reflect one another, but they go nowhere beyond that. And I would say this is an example of, well, as she says, the end of the world, that she's primarily saying if we fix our gaze on otherness only, we get trapped in a kind of play of mirrors and only end up in the murky depths, and we don't dissolve dichotomy. I would venture to say most of you have seen Frida Kahlo's work. These are two of Frida's that I particularly like. She always denied being a surrealist. Andre Breton journeyed to Mexico and said, "Oh, you're a surrealist." It was sort of a colonization. He wanted to claim her. She says she did. She just always did what she did, surrealism or not. This is the two Fridas. This is an example of self-reference. And we have the heart that's internal here, the heart that's external there, and yet they're joined in some fashion. The clothing is different, but we have sort of, a play of self-reference that we're really looking at the female artist painting herself and not getting out of that. I'm painting myself, and I'm painting myself holding myself's hand, as an example. This is called The Column, and in this piece, she actually opens her body to show us the painful spinal cord. Some of you may know she had a severe back injury from a streetcar accident early in life, and all these sort of tacks in her body and nails reminiscent of the crucifixion. The third way was not just celebrating the body was the first, reversing the gaze was the second. The third way is to celebrate the mysticism of female empowerment. I was fortunate to get permission from this artist, Remedios Varo, from her 94-year-old widower, to use this as the cover of my second book. And this is called The Creation of the Birds, and she did this in 1958. And we have this female owl figure who has the musical instrument around her neck, right at her heart. The opening's even right over her heart chakra. And she is drawing and painting and writing, and these birds are coming up right from her page, and at the same time, there's a reciprocity between what she's doing and what the universe is doing as the starlight or the moonlight is coming down prismatically and igniting her creation into life. It's one of my very favorite pieces of art of all time. This is another of Remedios Varo's. This is called Solar Music. And in here, she's taking the light, a solar source, and this hermetic figure is actually playing it with a bow as it's coming down. This didn't come out as great as I hoped. The strings are usually more distinct. Try to imagine strings and that beam of light. And that's her response to that. Well, one of the things about surrealism is it tends to be looked at in monolithic terms, where we think that, well, it was just Andre Breton and Salvador Dali and a few people hanging around and doing exquisite corpse poems and painting and doing these surreal experiments. Surrealism never was a monolithic movement. There are surrealisms. There was, in fact, a parallel movement, people who had been either banned from the Surrealist circle by Andre Breton, or who decided to break out on their own. Particularly, there was the circle around the French philosopher Georges Bataille. He had a wonderful magazine called Documents. Robert Desnos, when he got kicked out of the movement, the sleep talker, he migrated over to Bataille's circle as an example. And they had a slightly different orientation. Well, there's a group here who were called the Grand Jeu, the big game. And they called themselves the Simplists. Interestingly, there were only 4 of them. So if there's anyone here who'd like to start a literary movement, just go ahead and grab 3 other people, and you have something ready-made here with the Simplists. They were punks. They were young punks, basically. The most memorable of them being René Damal, who taught himself how to read Sanskrit at age 19 and became a tremendous scholar of the ancient yogic treatises. But again, they weren't sure of how to access the unconscious. They would play Russian roulette, for instance, to try to draw closer to the death experience. They began inhaling ether and carbon tetrachloride as ways to approximate death. And interestingly, I've often thought that Damal, he died early from tuberculosis, and I've always found that just an interesting chance occurrence because of the breathing of carbon tetrachloride. There's never been a study that links carbon tetrachloride to tuberculosis, so I don't want to overstate my point. But I've often thought in practicing death, in many ways, Damal brought about energetically his own early demise. But they did have it together in some ways, one of which was there was a series of attacks between Breton's group and the Big Game. And the Big Game, Le Grand Jeu, had a magazine with that title. And so Damal, and with characteristic panache, published a piece called Open Letter to André Breton. And this is what he said. And in the area of positive research, what have you done since the founding of Surrealism? We have the unlimited field in every conceivable mental direction of Hindu yoga, the systematic confrontation of the lyrical and dreamlike fact with the teachings of occult tradition and those of the so-called primitive mind, and we're not finished yet. I mentioned Surrealism as a world movement. Some key figures here in the French, people I've mentioned already, but I want to show you that this is not a fly-by-night thing. Vicente Alexandre from the Spanish won the Nobel Prize. If that's any indication, if we could look at that as, well, is it just a bunch of people getting up and pronouncing gibberish in the Café Voltaire as the Dadaists did? Or is there literary merit here? Pablo Neruda, another Nobel laureate. Cesar Vallejo, one of my favorite poets, was not a Nobel laureate, though he should have been. Octavio Paz, a Mexican poet, won the Nobel Prize. The Greeks, Odysseus Elitis, won the Nobel Prize. George Seferis won the Nobel Prize. And interestingly, just for kicks, I wanted to throw up Nicholas Callas' name here, because few people but me know that his real name was Kalamaras. He changed it, I don't know why, but he was the first Greek surrealist, Nicholas Kalamaras. The Japanese, very few people are doing research in Japanese surrealism. I'm one of them. I recently have done some studies, some articles on Takaguchi Shuzo, who was imprisoned by the Japanese fascists because his charge was he practiced surrealism. Takahashi Shinkichi became a Zen monk, but he began as a Dadaist, and I've done some research on him as well. And also I want to note the West Indian and African tradition, what these poets refer to as negritude. Aimé Césaire was a prime minister of Martinique. He was a fantastic surrealist writer. L.S. Senghor was the very first president of Senegal when it got its independence from France. So these are people who have some chops to them and have some political smarts about them as well. I'd like to move this now to sharing some of the surrealist writing, and then I want to share some of my surrealist writing, and then we'll call it an evening. I adore this poem by Aimé Césaire, who I mentioned is from Martinique and was the founder with L.S. Senghor of the movement of negritude. This is The Lost Body, and this is just part of it. But I love how he fractures language, where he uses nouns as verbs and vice versa. You know, Krakatoa, I who Krakatoa. We wouldn't say that. We think about Krakatoa as an event. We don't think about, what are you doing today? Well, I think I might Krakatoa. How about you? I who Krakatoa. I who everything better than a monsoon. I who open chest. I who Laelaps. Laelaps, of course, was Zeus's mythological dog who could never fail at a hunt. I who Laelaps. I who bleed better than a cloaca. I who outside the musical scale. I who Zambezi, or frantic, or rhombos, or cannibal. I would like to be more and more humble and more lowly, always more serious, without vertigo or vestige, to the point of losing myself falling into the live semolina of a well-opened earth. Outside, in lieu of atmosphere, there'd be a beautiful haze, no dirt in it, each drop of water forming a sun there, whose name, the same for all things, would be delicious, total encounter. So that one would no longer know what goes by, a star or a hope, or a petal from the flamboyant tree, or an underwater retreat raced across by the flaming torches of Aurelian jellyfish. This is not a narrative poem. I got up, I cleaned the asparagus, I made dinner, I had a vision about my grandmother, and I felt good. This is a poem that is trying to intentionally disrupt our discourse, to fracture the syntax, and create a dream so that we have no option, really, but to yield to the pure visionary content of the poem. This becomes a poem, even later in the later sections, it's a very long poem, of negritude. And this poem becomes a returning to primitive rhythms and primitive sayings as a way to reclaim the discourse of the enslaved. This is my favorite poet, Cesar Vallejo. I know of no other poet who moves me so. He was a Peruvian surrealist. And I want to read you a poem of his. It's too long to put on a slide. And I'd like you to try to pay attention if you can. See if you can pick out the series of paradoxes in which he works toward trying to dissolve dichotomy by basically neutralizing a this or a that. And this has no title. It simply begins, "For several days, I have felt an exuberant political need to love." For several days, I have felt an exuberant political need to love, to kiss affection on its two cheeks. And I have felt from afar a demonstrative desire, another desire to love, willingly or by force, whoever hates me, whoever rips up his paper, a little boy, the woman who cries for the man who was crying, the king of wine, the slave of water, whoever hid in his wrath, whoever sweats, whoever passes, whoever shakes his person in my soul. And I want, therefore, to adjust the braid of whoever talks to me, the hair of the soldier, the light of the great one, the greatness of the little one. And I want to iron directly a handkerchief for whoever is unable to cry, and when I am sad or happiness hurts me, to mend the children and the geniuses. I want to help the good one become a little bit bad, and I badly need to be seated on the right hand of the left-handed, and to respond to the mute, trying to be useful to him as I can. And also I want very much to wash the lame man's foot, and to help the nearby one-eyed man sleep. Ah, love, this one my own, this one the world's, interhuman and parochial, maturely aged. It comes perfectly timed from the foundation, from the public groin, and coming from afar makes me want to kiss the singer's muffler, and whoever suffers to kiss him on his frying pan, the deaf man on his cranial murmur, undaunted. Whoever gives me what I forgot in my breast, on his Dante, on his Chaplin, on his shoulders. I want, finally, when I am at the celebrated edge of violence or my heart full of chest, I would like to help whoever smiles laugh, to put a little bird right on the evil man's nape, to take care of the sick, annoying them, to buy from the vendor, to help the killer kill a terrible thing. And I would like to be kind to myself in everything. I promised a few of my poems. I want to give you maybe 4 or 5 of these and talk about how they work in surrealism. I'm so used to giving a reading and walking into it thinking, well, everybody's going to think this stuff sounds weird, just like the early slides. The greatest thing about this lecture tonight was that I could create a 40-minute context or whatever for surrealist art. I want to give you one that has a little bit more of a storyline to it. I think I have it by heart. If not, I'll cheat, but I think I have it. As many of you know, I recently turned 50 last year, and this is a poem that explores being 50 and not having children. It's something that Marianne and I have never particularly been interested in, so it's not a poem about grief, but it's certainly a poem that examines life choices. And I've always loved the name Delia. Delia. It's the name of a famous poet, Kenneth Rexroth. It's the name of his mother, Delia. And I always thought if I had ever had a daughter, I would have named her Delia. So I'd like you to see if you can pay attention in here to the arc of association and some of the leaps that the poem will make that may at first sound weird, but may even be humorous, hopefully. Had I had a daughter named Delia. Had I had a daughter, I would have named her Delia. Nobody names their sons George anymore. The name Delia contains the sway of a dark fluid flower. Nobody names their daughters Delia anymore. Had I a fish, I would have called it beloved whooping cough, to which I am inscribed. Nobody calls their coughs tenderly anymore. Had I loved a fig, I would have called it certain lovely fig in the now of my mouth. No one describes the mouth now of lovely anymore. Had Delia and I been father and daughter, I would have held her fever, clutched her daily dissolve, taught her the invisible, all the ways of softness I know. Even how to release that certain vulnerable hunch she'd no doubt inherit from my own childhood strain. No one teaches touch anymore, a way to kiss the inside bleeding of a star anymore. Had Delia asked me, Dad, I don't understand boys. I am unsure of my sway, the mood of my moon. How can I rejoice? I would have named her Normal. No one is named Normal anymore. Had I had a daughter named Delia, I would have loved her just for being my daughter. Asked her to name her daughter Delia too. At least not when you're 49 and male and childless and male. Nobody names their daughter's daughter anymore. I'm not going to go through the whole poem with you, but I wanted to show you a couple of surrealist turns in the beginning that we really, after we say, had I had a daughter named Delia, we really are expecting nobody names their daughters Delia anymore. I mean, when I grew up, people were named Donna and Joan and Cheryl, and the names have changed. There are trends. Names come in and out of fashion. The next stanza, the name Delia contains the sway of a dark fluid flower. I'm playing off of Dahlia at that point. And then there's a kind of satisfaction that comes back. We're expecting it. We've been let down. Nobody names their daughters Delia anymore. And then the big surrealist leap I wanted to see, then to move from there to, had I a fish? And what does that have to do with Delia? I would have called it beloved whooping cough, to which I am inscribed. Why would we even call a fish that? Why would we want to endear ourselves to whooping cough? And then the line, nobody calls their coughs tenderly anymore. The rest of the poem will meander around, flirt with sentimentality. And it was very important for me to find surrealism as a technique to engage the rest of the emotional content and not let it drift off into cliche. I want to give you another poem that's very strange and much more surreal. It's called Kingdom of Throat-Stuck Luck. I think I know this too. Beginning lines, I often tell my students, good, there's 2 doors in this room. That's a boon to this. The room I teach my poetry workshops in, there are 2 doors. And I tell them you can either walk in the door of meaning. I want my poem to mean this, that, or the other. Or you can walk in the door of language. I tend to mostly walk in the door of language. I have a piece of language that I'm writing that engages me, that disrupts me, that asks for some sort of resolution. And then I move from there and gather images that somehow respond to that. And the first image of this poem in Kingdom of Throat-Stuck Luck was, we were at the mercy of not having had anyone in the family die. I thought, man, that is weird stuff. What does that mean? How could you be at the mercy of having everyone in your family alive? Why would you be held captive by that? So this is Kingdom of Throat-Stuck Luck. This will have a wide arc of association. We were at the mercy of not having had anyone in the family die. We sang our song, we committed our talk, and working late seemed in our best interest. I sought everything crummy, an abomination of a raised arm at the back of a schoolroom. Without making a telegram of historical butter, the best we could do was share. Alexandria had been cut off from Egypt for many centuries by salt lakes. We experienced the torturing impact of a candle unconnected to the biography of lightning. When someone pointed to the moon, it meant sprained right ankle. When someone hacked a hunk of goldfish onto a hanky, it meant see the brilliant rain. Without history, we went on wearing sombreros. We distanced ourselves from hospital corridors and sarcophagi, from whiskey-colored wind, from our esophageal amnesia. Time and again we emerged from the kingdom of throat-stuck luck. All we knew was a pale blue light, the advantage of a back window, and an ensorceling phlegm with which to coat the long days of the throat. I wanted to share that poem with you today because I wanted to give you an example of the marvelous. This is an example what surrealists would call, when one of us pointed to the moon, it meant sprained right ankle. A juxtaposition. How could pointing to the moon mean that? When someone hacked a hunk of goldfish onto a hanky, it meant see the brilliant rain. We're going to turn something that is disgusting into something that's alive. It's a chunk of goldfish, or maybe not alive, but certainly something that had been alive, into something that's brilliant. And so this is one of the moves that actually gets made in that poem. I'm going to skip ahead. I know it's bad. I heard it's bad PowerPoint etiquette to do that, but I want to skip that poem because I want to close with 2 poems. This first poem I wanted to read because it really illustrates an arc of association, and then it also deals with chance occurrences. There's a great poem by Robert Desnos, whom I've spoke of before, called The Voice of Robert Desnos. It's one of my favorite surrealist poems. If it wasn't so long, I'd give it to you tonight. In the middle of it, I should say this figure down here is Yvonne George, who was reputed to be the illegitimate child of a famous French decadent poet, Gerard de Nerval. You may have heard of him. He was the poet who used to walk around and had his lobster. He had a pet lobster who he walked around on a leash. He'd take it for a walk every afternoon. And Yvonne George was a dance hall singer, and Robert Desnos had it bad for her. This is a series of an example of unrequited love that was never fulfilled, obviously. But there's a moment in this poem where he says, I call the flesh, I call the one I love, I call the one I love, I call the one I love. And then the last few lines of the poem, he says, flesh trembles when I call, the one I love is not listening, the one I love does not hear, the one I love does not answer. As an exercise, I thought, wouldn't it be gutsy to write a poem called The Voice of George Kalamaras? And what would the voice of George Kalamaras be? And I wanted to adopt some of the rhythms of the one I love, the one I love, the one I love. There's a chance occurrence in the poem. This is a true story. My second book that had been bounced around to a couple of publishers, and I pulled it off, sending it out for, 8 years maybe. I sent it to a place, and I've always had a totemic relationship with the former Beatle, George Harrison. He's always been one of my heroes. And the day that George Harrison's ashes were scattered over the river Ganges was the day that book got accepted for publication. And they were scattered on a spot where Marianne and I had gone and meditated a decade before. That was too weird not to get into a poem. My stepfather, who raised me, also died on my birthday, which I always felt was another chance occurrence in the surrealist sense, in which we are bonded for life this way. People say, oh, doesn't that bum you out every time you think of your birthday? Oh, gosh, no. I think that we're bound. We weren't bound by blood, and now we're bound with this incredible gift of him passing on my birthday. He lived a good, long life. He died when he was 86. There are a series of figures here in this poem. Totems for me as well. Greek surrealist Yanis Ritsos gets mentioned. George Seferis gets mentioned in this poem. Miguel Hernandez, who Franco killed, threw in a prison during the Spanish Civil War. Odysseus Elitis, the Nobel laureate that I mentioned earlier. Ravi Shankar has meant a great deal to me in my life. Charles Mingus, Jorma Kaukonen of the Jefferson Airplane. They all make guest appearances in this poem. And Brahms, Johannes Brahms. I couldn't decide which George Harrison photo to use. They both were really cool, so I used them both. So here's George with his hair really long, and here's George learning to play the sitar. Of course, Astro Man himself, Jimi Hendrix. If you want to read my poem for Jimi, come by the English department. It's up on display right now. My beloved Cesar Vallejo, and my yogic teacher, Paramahansa Yogananda. So I'll leave this one up while it's up. There were too many to have on one screen. This is the voice of George Kalamaras after Robert Desnos. So like a scar and a particle of Brahms, my five-pointed want, and the shadow of a boy too young for divorce, the joyful ache of 3 a.m. alone this foggy morning. So like every scar and every prong, it's the far-off cry of a train complaining the track, and the worms in the dirt thrip as if they belonged in someone's gut. I crawl to me all those I have lost. An adagio's violin, a taxidermy in my chest, Vallejo's most moist, a leopard and a tree. I bleed my name in secret across her dirt. I beg her mammalian face of rich African veldt, of hyena salt, of the stutter blood of a baby zebra breathing its just stunned past. I hear the elephants shuffle as they pass the tusk of a 3-month dead ancestor who sought a watering hole 300 kilometers from their home. I sense urgency in the herd doing the bone worship, and how the scent of belonging belongs to us all, and etch my regret in foreign grass. I call Brahms and his cardigan down from the docks. I call Brahman. I call Vallejo. I call Elitis, Seferis, and Ritsos. I cry for, but do not call, my beloved Miguel, though I refer to him tenderly and in private, not as Hernandez, but as exact extract of olive root, or onion tentacle starlight, or scar on my forehead. The one I want wants joy. The one I want wants joy. The one I want, I most simply want. To be born from two parents, reduced to one angry mound of table salt on either side of the state line, and then grow up wanting to die. I tug the hypnagogic and the relief. I mouth strange Peruvian skeletal urge. I mouth the condor's winged bleed. The predestined collapse of a father's lung, precisely at 12:03, is enough to make a son fear his own birthday thereafter, every December 3rd. The leopard and the oak cry out for progeny they can never bear, like Ravi, not begetting Mingus, not begetting Jimmy, not begetting Yorma. Why was the book accepted for publication after 17 years, the day they scattered George Harrison's ashes over the exact spot on which I'd prayed a decade before on the banks of Mother Ganga? I receive stares of strangers like exotic house pets. I care for iguanas, salamanders, a baby marsupial still worm pink and screaming the long road of fur across its mother's belly after only 26 days in the uterus. The giving and the dread take up residence in my gut. Earthquakes shatter the semblance of my wronged. I want to rock and be rocked. I want to hold and be whole. I want a black silk stocking in the mouth, and I want its how. I want the why of its thigh and the how come. I need the bleed of her name, and I require her to recite it backwards 3 times with her head turned to the left, though I don't know whose name she might speak and what wing my left arm might become. I want to hatch from one of the only 3 species of egg-laying mammals in New Guinea. I want the duck-billed platypus's electrical find to river food, and the impulse of the current and the male's poisonous spur on the leg. I want to paint the walls of my puja room saffron and sink a pool with carp, only to dismiss the color difference between black and gold. I want to sit in perfect asana, forget my flesh, and in doing so, lay marigolds at the feet of Yogananda. The forgeries of the night express themselves as far-off trains, strangers about to couple on the track. Something like autumn and damp oak leaves and a stark wind make my chest. I expand and induce October in the cool fires of the brain. Meditators through the bone of the toe, listen to my choice. The Ganges, like a snake, unwinds sacred in my mane. The driven and the led declare my grave. Cosmonauts conglutinate my asp. I want to include in my broom every speck of lust. Keep a cow, a tongue-licked calf, a pack of hounds, all named, teach me how not to hurt. The one I love is inside me. The one I love is near and far. The one I love is a handkerchief and a hurt. And finally, this evening, I want to give you one more poem because I think it, one of the things it does besides an arc of association is it tries to reimagine, reconfigure eroticism. I talked about that earlier. The poem is going to move erotically from an ancient Chinese courtesan of the 7th century to the beloved, to feeding my dog her dinner. Dave, you asked about my dog earlier. She is here in the poem. To an eroticism of language. Ultimately, an eroticism of the speaker feels erotic about eating a bowl of soup. He feels erotic about reading a book about coyotes. And so this is reclaiming Eros as a force, defining force in the universe. And this is called the translation of gratitude. Julia Meek, my friend Julia Meek, asked me to do a poem for a solstice gig we were doing. And she wanted poems, I thought. So I found all these old Chinese poems, which I've always loved Chinese poetry. And I sent them to her, and she said, these are nice, but I want you to do a poem. And as anybody knows me, I don't do poems on demand. I have to walk through the door of language. I can't walk through the door of this is what the poem's about. The poem becomes about something once I deal with language. So I was lamenting the fact that I wasn't going to be able to honor our friendship and participate in the reading, and was out on a walk. I was about 3 miles away from home. I usually take long walks, and about 3 miles away from home, this poem started coming to me, this poem of gratitude. So I couldn't get home fast enough to transcribe it and work with it. There's one mention in here about a diffembakia that Marianne and I have had. We have been together 28 years, the 28th of this month, by the way. And we have a diffembakia that is either 28 or 27 years old, cuttings of it still. I think the rest of the references will be pretty clear. This is, the Dissolution of Dichotomy. This is a poem that tries to have an incantation against dichotomy, the translation of gratitude. No, not the words give or receive. Not here, take this tongue, nor I will only love you once every other Thursday at 9. But the many lives I've led just to arrive here at this certain point of sun. But the cold moon blanching my breath this winter solstice with its strange work of worms. Paramecia, amoeba, the cloudy scrawl of deep water squid. The Hindu scriptures say it takes more than 1 million lives just to become human. All the things I was, craved, cave walls, paint, buffalo blood, protozoa of the blood axe, centipede pain absorbing invisible sparks of Saturn's torrential turn, the Bronze Age, splinters in the wheel, even a horse from the Chinese Tang dynasty. Yes, I adore Chinese poetry. Li Po, Du Fu, Li Ho, Han Shan, Meng Chao, especially Wang Wei. Perhaps I once was a Chinese poet. If not Wang Wei, then maybe one of his courtesans. The one with the milky white breasts, the one with the delicate wrist and blue rivers of blood, lover of bamboo in bamboo. If not the courtesan, then threads in her open robe. If not the robe, then a parasite entering her mysteriously from below through the sole of the left foot as she walks barefoot on a dirt floor. Some part of me is always translated, always inexact. When I told Marianne yesterday, shit, it's cold outside, I meant, how many sleep breaths have we shared together with the diffembakia these past 28 years? When I give my beagle her dinner, it's not just I love you, but there once was a constellation of a heron feeding from my chest. Not the words yes and no, but black balloon, white, white snow of the solstice. I look out onto the darkest snow of the year. Ice fields blister even the whites of my eye. If I were to give fully of myself without receiving, if I were to walk among the absent leaves as if the season of healing were only a snow squall away. So, we were writing poems in class last winter from a common list of words. Troy gave us snowberry, which none of us knew, but which we all believed delicious. Lynn Ann said Van Gogh. Jenny, linger. Brian, daffodil. Lori, Canada. I can't remember Sarah's word, but know it had something to do with salt and was the one I needed at just the right moment. What simple thing do we need most when we step into this body for its brief bout of breaths finally and become human? How now the scar? How now our mouths? How now do we learn to translate the seductive sway of our own arm hair? We have lost the olfactory drift of our tails, not by bounty hunters in Oregon, as in Don Coyote, that poor coyote with 3 legs and no tail I read about in a book by Dayton Hyde, bought from 2 booksellers who happened to be 2 brothers in Fort Wayne named Hyde. We have lost the hidden kiss, the way to be another's dearest and most moist, the road of salt and sweat and secret hair stubble around the underarm scar I would tongue of and lick. Yes, I eroticize everything. Even the slurping of a bowl of North African vegetable soup from the food co-op, chickpeas, coriander, and the potatoes slow roast, carried home last Saturday so I could eat it while listening to Julia Meek's folk tales. Even the reading of a book about coyotes as I take it tenderly on my lap in the intimate dark, in that certain way, by a certain lamp, near a certain wife and fire. No, not give or receive, not love or hate, never this tongue or that, not a translation for gratitude, the discourse of the obviate, the inexact, not anything among the cruel influence of dualism. But the adorable darkness of the darkest night of the year, consuming me almost whole, as if I am only upthrust dust among the fallow seed. I turn my fierce, my moist, my yet to blossom, yet bowing sunflower self, not just toward the light, but into each brilliant point of that imaginary constellation waiting above me in eelgrass, thick and feeding its spooky swamp neck dark into my chest. The great blue star-bitten heron feeds me, feeds from me, like the 13th century Persian poet Rumi, whose words float still through the ether, who closes a poem with, "There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground." I write this poem with gratitude to each of the 10,000 things that feed me, feed into me here in Fort Wayne near the solstice as just one way to kneel upon, to heal that ground. Thank you very much for coming. Michael, you had your hand up?
Yeah, George, I had 3 questions for you, actually, just like a fairy tale. The first one was kind of surrealist. And I was just interested in the sort of history and culture of all the stuff that you're talking about so much. Surrealist questions first. Do you think that Dadaism and surrealism are parent and child, cousin, or sibling?
Boy, I'd hate to get locked into an either or. I would probably say either parent and child or sibling, because they did coexist together. But I mean, if my back was to the wall, I'd have to say parent and child in terms of They became equal, like parents and children can be when the children grow up, but one really did develop from the other.
The other two questions are a little more straight.
Okay.
Academic. Do you see historical, cultural forces essentially making Dadaism happen in the year that it did, the year or two that it sort of...
Very definitely, and I sort of went over Dada so quickly. It really was World War I. Yeah. I mean, it really and truly, I mean, in a nutshell. And there's just, I mean, maybe the time was ripe for it anyway, but the sense that the Dadaists really thought that the entire language that we used, everything was inscribed with lies, because that was the huge turning point. So absolutely, I would say yes.
The other thing is, you may have had some of the same education I have, because we're about the same age, and had some of the same sorts of grad courses, studying. And I was just curious, do you see Dadaism and Surrealism sort of leaking out any into the, the sort of canonical high modernist writers,
I do.
Influenced by Joyce, Pound.
Yeah, Eliot.
Yeah.
I would never call them surrealist, but Sam Hyde's here tonight, and he got a book for me once. He came in and he actually gave it to me. It was an old surrealist text. And they included people in there like James Joyce and Wallace Stevens, who are anything but surrealist. But what they did share was that sense of experimentation, as you said, high modernist, that sense of experimentation. And again, I think in the wake of World War I, it was a response to what can we do so that we can break down the traditional narrative structures of a poem. You think about Eliot, for instance, in The Wasteland. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. It just keeps coming back in and out of that poem. So absolutely, I would see that. Although I would never call them surrealist.
Oh, right.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have time for, I think, probably one.
Okay.
Before they...
Kick us out?
Yeah, pretty much.
Can we do two, since Hermine and Steve got up at the same time?
All right.
Okay.
Talking about Joyce, Eliot, and so forth, when I saw the painting of the reclining coffin, it reminded me instantly of the 17th century poet George Herbert, who, as you know, is my first love and last. And I believe it's in his poem, The Pilgrimage, that the ending is, and death is but a chair.
Ooh,
and I thought you might like to know that.
I will. I will filter that.
A mode of transportation from one state to
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with me.
One thing that struck me, and it kind of relates back to this high modernism theme that Michael talked about, as I was listening and hearing the poetry of these surrealists and associating them with these names of people who were somewhat known for their giant egos in a certain way, like Breton and Dali, of course. The writing itself and the aesthetics of the art seemed to be almost be a deconstruction of those egos. And I was reminding of a line in Virginia Woolf's, one of her essays, where she talks, I think it's in Moments of Being, where she talks about her art being about becoming imperceptible, about the ego becoming imperceptible. And I felt some of that in some of the language I was hearing tonight. And I wonder if you talk about the dissolution of that dichotomy between the ego and the...
I will very briefly. I think one of the things that happens when the language... the ego's a tricky thing. You could disjoint the language, you could disrupt the syntax, and the ego could be very much present still in terms of, boy, aren't I skillful, right? I mean, I wouldn't even begin to try to say I could tell if the ego's gone. But one of the things that begins to happen in someone like Aimé Césaire, for instance, when the language becomes... He becomes the culture. Now, maybe one could argue that the ego then becomes stronger. One develops a sense of that they're larger than themselves. But so many of these poets, Aimé Césaire, André Breton, gave their lives to work as a practice and not simply to making a name. Some people would argue the opposite with Breton, but if you really look at him, he really wanted to create a revolution in terms of consciousness. I think the key for me goes back to how does one regard their art? Is art something that you want to be congratulated over? Is art something that you want to use as commerce, in culture? Or is art a spiritual practice? And we could even put spiritual in parentheses. Is it a practice? Gary Snyder talks about the real work of the poet. And the real work is that you do the work, and in doing the work, it becomes an attentiveness practice. And that's what we're after, is charging our attention, rekindling our awareness. Publications and all that don't ultimately matter if you're involved in the practice of poetry. So I know, Steve, I didn't really answer your question. I wanted to sort of talk at it. Who can tell where the ego lies? But I think for me, an indicator is, are we regarding our work as a practice that we would do even if we were on some desert island somewhere and all we had was paper and pencil and it was an attentiveness practice? Maybe that's the closest I could get to saying, okay, now we're dissolving the ego.
I want to thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Mike. Thank you all for coming.
I have here a modest certificate of appreciation presented to you
Oh, my goodness.
As distinguished lecturer for April 10th, 2007. So I get to give that to you.
Thank you so much.
And I want to invite all of you to the lobby in the back for cookies and arts and sciences punch. And we are adjourned. Thank you all for coming.
This is beautiful. Oh, thank you. Thank you.